Hello students, today we will be discussing the most important and frequently asked exam question from Thorax, the first chapter, that is Introduction to Thorax. So let's start with today's class. The first question is the sternal angle. It's a very important 5 marker. So what exactly is this sternal angle? First we will give explanation and then we will see what has to be written and which diagram has to be drawn. So this sternal angle, the bone which you are seeing here, this is the clavicle. This is the manubrium and this is the sternum. So just above the manubrium you have a space and that is known as suprasternal space or the suprasternal notch. 5 centimeters approximately below the suprasternal notch, you have a transverse ridge. This ridge is known as sternal angle or the angle of Lewis. Now what is the importance of this angle and why you should know this angle? The first and foremost important thing is that it helps us to count the ribs because from the sternal angle, the onset of second rib. So you can go downwards. Next will be the third rib, fourth rib and so on. So the first and foremost important thing is the sternal angle or the angle of Lewis helps us to count the ribs. So at the sternal angle, which rib do you have? You have the second costal cartilage and the second rib. The second important thing is that if you draw a plane at the sternal angle, it will divide the mediastinum into superior mediastinum above and inferior mediastinum below. Now what is this mediastinum? In between the two lungs, what space you have, that space is known as mediastinum. The other important thing, most important events occurring at this sternal angle is that what you're seeing here is the trachea. So the trachea bifurcates into two bronchi, principal bronchi at the sternal angle. Another thing is you're seeing the thoracic duct here. The thoracic duct moves on the right side. It crosses from the right to the left side at T5 and it reaches the left side at the sternal angle. The another important thing is what you're seeing in green color is the azygous vein. This vein arches over the root of the right lung at the sternal angle. Now, these are the points which are most expected for this question. So, you will introduce the topic. You will just box introduction and you will say what is sternal angle. It's a transverse ridge about 5 centimeters below the suprasternal notch. It marks the manubriosternal joint and it lies at the second costal cartilage anteriorly and posteriorly it cuts T4 T5 vertebrae. Now what diagram are you supposed to draw here in case this is asked? You will draw the manubrium first. So this is how you draw the manubrium. Then you will draw the sternum. So this is the manubrium and this is the sternum. So this transverse ridge is nothing but our sternal angle. So from this transverse ridge you are going to get the second rib. So this is the second rib. So this simple diagram can be drawn in case if this question is asked. Now again, what's the importance of this? Your next subheading will be importance. One is already discussed. It helps in counting of the ribs. Second is you already know that it separates the superior mediastinum and the inferior mediastinum. And the third thing is the ascending aorta ends at the sternal angle. Arch of the aorta begins and ends at the sternal angle. Descending thoracic aorta begins at the sternal angle. And already discussed, trachea divides into two principal bronchi here. We already discussed azygous vein arches over the root of the right lung. and opens into superior vena cava. We also discussed that the pulmonary trunk divides into two pulmonary arteries just below this level, and thoracic duct crosses from right to the left at T5. It reaches the left at the level of sternal angle. So these are the catchy points for this answer, for this question. Now we will discuss the suprapleural membrane or the Simpson's fascia, which is a very important 5 marker which is asked several times. So what exactly is this? So your first heading will be under introduction. You will write that this membrane is nothing but a diaphragm which will separate the cervical region from the thorax. So what you're seeing in green color here, this is only our suprapleural membrane or the Simpson's fascia. This acts as a diaphragm and it separates the cervix from the thorax. So in introduction you will write that it is a cervicothoracic diaphragm. Your next heading will be what's the morphological significance of this? Actually, this is a flattened tendon of a muscle of the neck which is called as scalenus minimus. Now, what is the attachment of the Simpson's fascia? So this is the 7 cervical vertebrae. This is the transverse process of 7 cervical vertebrae. So Simpson's fascia is attached from the transverse process of 7 cervical vertebrae all the way to the first rib, that is the attachment. What is the function of this? One thing is it provides rigidity to the thoracic inlet, and the other thing is that when we inspire and expire air, the apex of the lung is prevented from popping out of the root of the neck. So it prevents puffing up of the root of the neck during inspiration and expiration. Now what is the relation? Superiorly we have the subclavian artery, subclavian vein, and inferiorly we have the cervical pleura covering the apex of the lungs. Now what diagram you are supposed to draw here? First you will draw C7 vertebrae. You will draw the transverse process. This is the intervertebral disc followed by C8 vertebrae. You draw the first rib here. This is the first rib. Then the membrane attaching these two is nothing but our Simpson's fascia. Now what is anteriorly is your subclavian artery and subclavian vein. Then we have the lungs. This is the lung surrounding the cervical pleura. This is the cervical pleura. So this diagram should be drawn for this question. Now the next 3 markers from this chapter is the cervical rib. What is this? To introduce the topic, introduction is your first heading. It is a supernumerary rib which is attached to the transverse process of C7 vertebrae. This occurs in approximately 0.5 to 1% of the population. So you already know that it's attached to the transverse process of which vertebrae? 7 cervical vertebrae. What is the applied aspect? Why you should know this? That's because this cervical rib actually exerts traction. It gives pressure over the lower trunk of brachial plexus. Thereby, it brings about symptoms like abnormal sensation along the ulnar border of the forearm. So, this should be written for cervical rib if it is asked for a 3 marker. So, we have discussed all the questions asked so far from the chapter Introduction to Thorax. There is one question here which is what are the structures passing through the openings of the diaphragm, which will be discussed along with a 10 marker, that is the diaphragm. So that's all for today's class. Thank you so much for watching this video.